Let the cold edge of the breeze cut through the thick coat I had bought from a tiny shop on Via dei Banchi, bought on impulse, like a promise to the woman in the mirror, and I thought about how strange it felt that the thing I had loved most had become the thing that hurt me most, how someone who had once been my whole world had one morning become a stranger with keys in a suitcase and a voice that called me useless. And I understood then that grief is not only the falling apart, it is also the careful rebuilding that comes after, the slow and stubborn stitching that no one sees because it happens behind closed doors and quiet mornings when you teach yourself to breathe in a new way. I sat on the bench until my fingers were numb and the lake looked like a black sheet dotted with silver nails, and when I went home I made tea though I did not want it, because habit is a small, stubborn friend, because making the tea was a thing my hands remembered before my heart could, and the sound of water in a small kettle is somehow a language in which sorrow and hope can both be spoken if you listen closely. I wrote a list that night, not of what I had lost, but of what I wanted to learn, a line for each small, ordinary thing that had been waiting for me like unopened mail. Learn to braid my hair differently, learn the words to a song I had always hummed but never known, learn to paint the sky as I saw it now, not as someone else had told me it should be. I made the list with a pen that left a heavy black mark like a coal smudge on the paper, and when I closed the drawer I felt ridiculous and brave all at once, the way a child looks at a bike they have never used and knows, somehow, that the wind will teach them how. Days folded into months in a strange, soft way. The bookstore became my scaffolding and my confession. I spent mornings arranging the books in narrow, forgiving stacks, the kind of stacks that let you slide a hand through and find a world someone else has lived inside. I learned that people enter bookstores with the same tentative hope they reserve for strangers, a quiet expectation that, perhaps, here is a thing that will make them keep breathing. I painted small canvases and left them propped between travel guides and poetry, and sometimes customers would ask if they were for sale and I would say yes and watch as someone carried a little piece of my quiet into their day like a bread roll wrapped in newspaper. I kept a kettle on the old counter, and the smell of coffee and lemon cake gathered people like migrating birds. They would come for a book and stay for a story, and I started telling them about kitchens that smelled of garlic and rain, about the old woman in my childhood who could take a bad day and turn it into soup, about the lake that mirrored the moon and taught me patience. At first it felt odd to tell strangers the things I had told no one, confessions and quiet triumphs, but I learned that language has a way of knitting wounds into something that is not invisible anymore. There were small triumphs that felt as luminous as fireworks. The day a local newspaper wrote a piece about my little shop and used a picture of the yellow curtains I had sewn myself, the time a man came in and asked for a book in Urdu and sat there reading, weeping quietly, while I stood behind the counter pretending to dust, the afternoon a group of teenagers asked if they could hold a poetry night and filled the bookstore with voices that trembled and soared until the windows were fogged and the landlord came to knock and listen and then smiled as if some old sadness had been invited in and forgiven. The world, I discovered, has a gentle appetite for reinvention if you feed it small, honest things. I taught a weekly class on reading, like a life skill, and watched people, middle-aged men with trembling hands, young mothers who had not had a minute to themselves in years, an old teacher who had retired and was surprised to have the time to be surprised, discover how to slow down into a paragraph and live there for a while. I would stand at the back and watch them find language for small griefs and better hopes, and sometimes their words became my words, though none of them knew the history of how I had learned to be quiet and then loud again. My ex-husband's messages arrived in a scatter of tones, hesitant pleas, apologies folded like paper cranes, angry demands for a meeting, desperate offers to fix things as if love were a thing you could repair with an evening and flowers. There was one voicemail in particular, an outpouring of regret and a voice that sounded like he had been underwater for months, and at the end he said, "I am sorry," which is a sentence that can mean everything and nothing depending on who speaks it and how. I listened once, twice, and then I put the phone in a drawer and sat on the floor with my back to the shelves, surrounded by books that smelled of binding glue and history and strangers, and I thought about the ways in which apologies cannot bring back the years you gave away blindly. I did not return his calls, not because I was cruel but because I had learned an important thing. Absence gives space to remembrance that is honest, and reconciliation can only begin when both people are willing to reckon with truth, not with how they feel when they miss what they once had. Silence, sometimes, is not a vengeance, it is a choice of self-preservation. People asked me how I stopped waiting. They wanted a formula as if heartache were a recipe you could write down and hand to friends. I tried to describe it, to be useful to those who wanted answers, and I said the truth. There is no single moment you decide, there is a million small surrenderings and small victories. One morning you wake up and the first thought is not of the person who left you but of the flavor of coffee you want. One afternoon you stand before the mirror and correct your posture as if you were rehearsing a character you have always wanted to be. One night you accept a dinner invitation from a woman you met in art class and find yourself laughing so hard you forget to check your phone. The rebuilding is not a dramatic renaissance, it is the patient tending of a garden. You plant seeds that you never knew would grow, you plant a conversation with a neighbor, you plant a recipe learned from a stranger in a market, you plant the courage to close the heavy curtains on photos that hurt and open the lighter ones that tell other stories. I found friends in odd places. A retired sailor who taught me how to mend a torn sail and in the process, taught me how mending something sturdy requires both patience and the willingness to make small, careful knots. A young chef who offered me a cooking apprenticeship, not because he needed help, but because he liked the way I listened. A painter named Lucia who could argue about color the way others argued about weather, and who took my awkward strokes and showed me how to turn them into something intentional. Lucia and I would stand in a small studio that smelled of turpentine and lemon, and she would say, "Paint what you fear," which sounded like a cruel thing at first until I realized fear was only a shape that needed to be seen. I painted a canvas that was nothing but a deep, bruised purple, and when I finished I felt as if I had put my hand on the very place that hurt. Showing it at a local gallery felt like stepping into a room full of strangers and telling them a secret. Someone bought it and later wrote to me that the painting had made them feel less alone, and that sentence landed in me like rain. There were weeks when sorrow returned like a tide, predictable, crushing, and I would let it come. Healing was never the elimination of pain, it was learning the hospitality of pain. You invite it, you sit with it, you make tea, and then when it leaves you sweep the floor. I would go to the lake and sit on the bench and watch the geese whose lives seemed so simple and so honest, and sometimes I would bring a small book of Rumi and read a line aloud into the wind because the lake is a good listener and does not ask questions. Time did its ordinary, miraculous work. The raw edges softened, the memory of his voice lost some of its sharpness, and I began to think of him as a chapter, not the whole book. There were practicalities too, bills paid, calls returned, a tax form filled out by a patient accountant who taught me to sit through things I had always let someone else do. Each mundane victory felt like a small, secret heroism. On a clear afternoon, months after the wedding, he walked in. It is strange how the world can make ordinary things feel like a stage. He stood by the shelf of travel memoirs, fingers grazing spines as if looking for a place to anchor himself. He looked older, not only in the lines at his eyes but in the way his shoulders carried their own small sorrow. He paused by a display of seashells I had placed next to books about the coast, and then he crossed to the counter with the slow, uncertain steps of someone who has practiced apologies in the mirror and is tired of the reflection. We spoke like strangers who have shared a long, interrupted history. He asked about the shop, about the classes, about the people who came for tea. He said, "You look well," and I said, "Thank you," because truth, even when it is a small one, should be spoken plainly. He asked then, "Do you ever think about us?" As if the past were a window he could peer through and rearrange. I told him something simple, I used to. But now I only think about me. He stood there with something like regret carved into his face, and he said, "I made a mistake," and there it was again, the old, worn sentence that once might have felled me. I met him with a calm I had cultivated like a plant, watered, sunlit, surviving. I said, "Perhaps, people make mistakes, but not all mistakes need to be fixed by taking back what was taken." I watched him learn, in real time, that apologies are not always invitations. He left with his head bowed and a kind of exhausted humility that I felt no desire to exploit. Mercy, I had learned, is not for show. A young woman named Sarah became part of my life, a customer who became a friend, and she had a laugh that unfolded like a ribbon. Sarah had left an arranged engagement and moved to this small town to teach languages, and she and I would sit at the back of the shop and trade stories about second chances as if they were recipes we had perfected. We started a Sunday ritual. 2 cups of strong coffee, a walk around the lake, and then we sat on the same bench where I had once watched stars tremble. We would talk about small things, how to choose a good notebook, whether to buy a second petunia for the window, which book to read next. Little by little, these lists of ordinary things made the shape of a life I wanted to keep living. Romance came in small, startling ways. A man who ran the bakery down the lane, Marco, would bring extra loaves of warm bread and sometimes stand and listen when I spoke about color and tides. He did not try to fix me, he offered companionship that respected the lines I had drawn. We would talk about the weather and then about the sea. He would laugh at my terrible Italian, and I would make him laugh at my stubborn attempts to explain Urdu idioms. There was no hurry, no urgency to be stamped with a name. He was a person who liked my company and who, in his own cautious way, became part of the furniture of my days. One particular winter, when frost made the glass windows glitter like sugar, I opened an evening for letters. I asked people to bring a letter they had never sent, to anyone, a parent, a child, a lover, a self, and read it aloud. The room filled with voices that trembled and then grew firm, and at the end we cried and applauded, and a woman who had lost her husband that year held my hand and said, "You taught me to say what I had not said." The letters were small miracles. A man in his 70s asked forgiveness of his estranged brother, a teenager wrote an apology to a mother she had never thanked, a woman wrote to her younger self and promised to be kinder. The bookstore was full of ordinary confessions that hung like paper lanterns, and when the night ended the town seemed gentler for it. Time continued its strange work. Sometimes it takes a year, sometimes 10 summers, to become comfortable with oneself. My hair grew a little whiter at the temples and my laugh lines etched themselves deeper into the skin. I bought scarves in bright colors and refused to hide in neutrals as if I were taking up less space than I deserved. I began to travel again, not to run away but to befriend places. I went back to Italy every now and then, to the small room with the sea view, because it remained the place where I retaught myself how to be alone and in love with life. I learned to love the silence that is not an absence but an invitation to listen. People who had once seen me only as a wife now saw me as an author of small stories, of recipes, of murals and markets and mornings. When the high school asked me to speak to a class about resilience, I told them a simple thing: resilience is learning how to be tender with yourself in the days when everyone else requires you to be brave. They clapped and then asked questions that were honest and raw and made me think of how brave it is to be young and uncertain. Years passed and the bookstore became a place where lives intersected without needing to be dramatic about it. A child would ask for a story and then, having been told, would offer me a drawing in return. A couple would come in, awkward with new love, and ask for advice on what to read together. A woman from the city asked if we could host a book club and brought with her an energy that made the shelves hum. Together we argued about characters and cried over endings and had the kind of debates that change the shape of you little by little. I started a small series of workshops called Stories for a New Beginning, and people from all ages came to write letters to futures they wanted. It was strange and wonderful to watch people make promises to themselves and to write them down as if ink could be a ladder. One evening, some years after he had first left, he returned again. He waited outside as if the bookstore were a confessional and then entered with a gentle, nervous gait. He looked at the shelves and then at me, and there was a pause in which time folded like a page. He said, "I see you are well," and I replied, "I am," because it was true in the way only particular truths are. He asked if we might speak, and I let him for a moment, enough for an honest exchange, not for the kind of forgiveness that erases what was. He asked about the last years and about Italy and about whether I had ever been happy. I told him of the mornings that felt like miracles, the smell of fresh bread, the way light moves on a favorite page, the sound of someone laughing in the back of the store, and he listened as if hearing a language that had once been familiar and was now foreign. He told me he had been lonely, that the woman he had married left because she wanted a different life, that time had rendered many things plain. He asked, finally, if there could be friendship between us. I looked at him and saw a man who had learned something the expensive way, who had been given a second chance in the form of solitude and had not known quite how to keep it. I said, perhaps, because I wanted to be generous but also honest, friendship would be possible only if it came without expectation, only if it arrived as a kindness unburdened by the need to reclaim what had been. He nodded, and there was a small, careful grace in that nod. There are nights when I still stand by the lake. The reflection of the stars is a constant teacher. It reminds me how the world contains infinite light and that even when things are fractured, the surface can catch it again. Sometimes I go alone and sometimes with someone who brings me soup and tells me jokes I do not have to explain. I tell myself stories about my life that are true and generous, that I loved deeply, that I lost deeply, and that I learned, over months and years and many quiet mornings, to love myself with the stubbornness of weeds growing through pavement. I am not the woman I was when he called me useless. That woman had not yet learned the durable joy of small things. I am not perfect. I am not immune to sorrow. I am, however, the author of my own mornings. I have friends who know my histories and do not use them as tools. I have a shop where voices are invited and some are allowed to rest. I have a life that is made of ordinary commitments that keep me tethered to the present, the making of bread, the watering of a plant, the choosing of a book for someone who needs to be held in words. If you ask me now what the end taught me, I will tell you this: beginnings are sometimes hidden inside losses. The end of one story can be the necessary birth of another. There is a fierce and quiet dignity in choosing yourself every day. There is also a stubborn power in small pleasures. The first sip of coffee that is exactly right, the sound of rain on a window, the way a stranger can smile at you across a room and remind you you are seen. I have learned to say no in a low, steady voice and to say yes with both hands. I learned that love is not scarcity. The fact that he loved someone else does not diminish the love I have to give myself. I have forgiven, not as an obliging act toward him but as an unburdening for myself, and I have kept a few things sacred, my mornings, my art, the rituals that remind me I exist beyond the name someone else gave me. So if you are listening and holding on to a voice that once named you something small, a voice that asked too much and gave too little, hear me when I say, you are not finished. There is no rule that says your best pages must be written before you are 50 or 60, some people bloom late because they needed more winters to grow strong roots. Make a list tonight of things you want to learn. Say a kind sentence to the woman in the mirror. Buy a ticket to a place you have only dreamed about and do not be ashamed of the trembling in your hands at the airport. Trembling is the sound of courage in motion. Start a small thing. A shop, a class, a garden, a painting, a series of Sunday letters. Let people come to you for tea and stay for your stories. Let your life be an accumulation of tiny, brave acts that, over time, look very much like a new life. I will not pretend it was easy every day. There were times I wanted to go back to the easy rhythm of being seen exclusively through someone else's eyes, because invisibility can be a comfortable kind of sleep. But the waking is worth the ache. The waking that allows you to choose your own music and to dance when no one is watching and to befriend strangers who will teach you how to laugh in new keys. I am not a tragic figure with a single wound, I am a person with many small stories, and each one matters. When he left, he thought he had taken the map to my life with him, but he had only misplaced it. I have redrawn the map in my own hand and found new routes to the sea. Later, when night arrives and the lake turns to black glass and the stars are no longer trembling but steady, I feel the kind of gratitude that is not loud but is vast. Gratitude for the small mercies, for the friends who stayed, for the strangers who became family, for the stubborn, ordinary things that make a life whole. I am not old in the way he meant it. I am seasoned, like good bread or like a well-read book. I am not dead. I am, finally and fiercely, alive. And if you are there, holding a cup of coffee whose warmth has faded because you forgot to drink it, set the cup down and walk out into the night. Let the world be bigger than the grief that holds you now. Start again with something small. A sentence, a step, a painting. The rest will build itself, quietly and beautifully, as long as you keep showing up.